guys, it's me, Miss Norris, and today I'd like to share a fun read aloud with you of the story Ruby the Copycat. This story was written in 1991 by Peggy Rathman, and I hope you really enjoy it. If you're ready to hear the story, I'm ready to share it with you. Here we go. Ruby the Copycat. I know the light's on the book a little bit, so I want to give you a close-up of that cover. You can see that I don't know which one is Ruby, but one of these ladies is Ruby, and you can see they're copying their bows and their dresses. I don't know if I would like that. Would you like to have someone that copied you? I don't know. I might. Here we go. Monday was Ruby's first day in Miss Hart's class. Class, this is Ruby, announced Miss Hart. Ruby, you may use the empty desk behind Angela. Angela is the girl with the pretty red bow in her hair. Angela smiled at Ruby. Ruby smiled at Angela's bow and tiptoed to her seat. So Ruby is here, and you can see Angela with the red bow. And they smiled at each other. Seems like they're off to a good start. I hope everyone had a pleasant weekend, said Miss Hart. Does anyone have something to share? I was the flower girl at my sister's wedding, said Angela. That's exciting, said Miss Hart. Ruby raised her hand halfway. I was a flower girl at my sister's wedding too. What a coincidence, said Miss Hart. Angela turned and smiled at Ruby. Ruby smiled at the top of Angela's head. Class, please take out your reading books, said Miss Hart. All right, so do you think Ruby was really in her sister's wedding? I'm not sure now. Let's see what happens next. At lunchtime, Ruby hopped all the way home on one foot. When Ruby came back to school, she was wearing a red bow in her hair. She slid into her seat behind Angela. I like your bow, whispered Angela. I like yours too, whispered Ruby. Class, please take out your math books, said Miss Hart. So at this school, they can go home for lunch, and Ruby hopped all the way home on one foot, which means it's probably not that far, but it's still pretty hard to do. And when she came back, she had a bow just like Angela's. On Tuesday morning, Angela wore a sweater with daisies on it. At lunchtime, Ruby hopped home sideways. When Ruby came back to school after lunch, she was wearing a sweater with daisies on it. I like your sweater, whispered Angela. I like yours too, whispered Ruby. So we can see when Ruby came to school in the morning, she was wearing a checkered shirt, and Angela was wearing a daisy shirt. She hopped home sideways and hopped on back with a sweater just like Angela's. On Wednesday, Angela wore a hand-painted t-shirt with matching sneakers. After lunch, Ruby hopped back to school wearing a hand-painted t-shirt and matching shoes. Why are you sitting like that? Whispered Angela. Wet paint, said Ruby. So on Wednesday, Angela came to school with matching painted shirt and shoes. Ruby hopped home and came back with a painted shirt and shoes, but she had to sit funny because She had just painted this shirt and shoes, and they were wet. On Thursday morning, during sharing time, Angela modeled the flower girl dress she wore to her sister's wedding. Ruby modeled her flower dress too, right after lunch. Angela didn't whisper anything. So Angela wore her flower girl dress for sharing time, and after lunch, Ruby had her flower dress on. So I guess she was in a wedding. But Angela didn't whisper that she liked it this time. By coincidence, on Friday morning, both girls wore red and lavender striped dresses. At lunchtime, Angela raced home. When Angela came back to school, she was wearing black. So on Friday, they accidentally wore the same outfit, but this time it was Angela that went home and she changed into all black. Now let's take a look at her face. Does she look like she's very happy? It doesn't seem that way. Sometimes it's kind of fun when someone does the same things as you, but sometimes it kind of gets on your nerves. And I think this is starting to get on Angela's nerves, but I'm not really sure why she's bothered yet. Maybe we'll find out. On Friday afternoon, Miss Hart asked everyone to write a short poem. Who would like to read first? Asked Miss Hart. Angela raised her hand. She stood by her desk and read. I had a cat I could not see because it stayed in back of me. It was a very loyal pet. It's sad we never really met. That was really good, said Miss Hart. Now who's next? Miss Hart looked around the room. Ruby? So Angela wrote about a pet kitty that she never really met because it always stayed behind her. And now Miss Hart is asking who'd like to go next. Maybe Ruby would. Ruby stood and recited slowly. I had a nice pet who I never met because it always stayed behind me. And I'm sure it was a cat too. Ruby smiled at the back of Angela's head. Someone whispered. Ruby sat down. What a coincidence, said Miss Hart. So it sounds like Ruby tried to copy Angela's poem, but did not make it quite the same. And now people are like, what? That's kind of weird. That's kind of strange. Why doesn't she just use her own brains? And Miss Hart is feeling a little like, I don't know what I should do. Even teachers don't always know what to do. Angela scribbled something on a piece of paper. She passed it to Ruby. The note said, You copied me. I'm telling Miss Hart. P.S. I hate your hair that way. Ruby buried her chin in the collar of her blouse. A big tear rolled down her nose and plopped onto the note. When the bell rang, Miss Hart sent everyone home, except Ruby. So Angela's pretty mad. She says, you copied my poem and I don't like it. And P.S. I don't like your hair this way. And it made Ruby very, very sad. She cried. And then everyone went home except for Ruby. Miss Hart closed the door of the schoolroom and sat on the edge of Ruby's desk. Ruby, dear, she said gently, you don't need to copy everything Angela does. You can be anything you want to be. but be Ruby first. I like Ruby." Miss Hart smiled at Ruby. Ruby smiled at Miss Hart's beautiful, polished fingernails. "Have a nice weekend," said Miss Hart. "Have a nice weekend," said Ruby. So Miss Hart just gave Ruby some really great advice. You don't have to do everything Angela does, but number one, be yourself first. Be yourself first. You're pretty good that way. On Monday morning, Miss Hart said, "I hope everyone had a pleasant weekend. I did. I went to the opera." Miss Hart looked around the room. "Does anyone have something to share?" Ruby waved her hand. Glued to every finger was a pink plastic fingernail. "I went to the opera too," said Ruby. "She did not," whispered Angela. Miss Hart folded her hands and looked very serious. "Ruby, dear," said Miss Hart gently, "did you do anything else this weekend?" So it sounds like Ruby has stopped copying Angela and is working very hard to copy Miss Hart. And Miss Hart is still like, "Be yourself, Ruby." Ruby peeled off a fingernail. "I hopped," said Ruby. The class giggled. Ruby's ears turned red. "But I did! I hopped around the picnic table 10 times. Ruby looked around the room. So you can see she's popped off all of her fingernails and she's telling the kids what she really did, which is she hopped. She hopped around her picnic table 10 times. That's not easy to do. And other kids are kind of laughing. But Ruby sprang from her desk. She hopped forward. She hopped backward. She hopped sideways with both eyes shut. Hop, 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 hop. Hopping this way, hopping that way, hopping backwards, hopping forwards. And look how happy she is when she's doing something she loves to do. The class cheered and clapped their hands to the beat of Ruby's feet. Ruby was the best hopper they had ever seen. Miss Hart turned on the tape player and said, "Follow the leader, do the Ruby hop." So Ruby led the class around the room while everyone copied her. So after thinking about it, they realized, hey, Ruby is doing something that looks really fun and she's really good at it. And Miss Hart said, "Let's all hop like Ruby." At noon, Ruby and Angela hopped home for lunch together. The end. Look at them hopping off into their homes for lunch with the real little red bow tied around it. The end. Ooh, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you really enjoyed the story Ruby the Copycat. If you did, please hit that thumbs up button at the bottom of the page. If you are already a subscriber, thank you so much for your support. But if you're not a subscriber yet, click the subscribe button down here at the bottom of the page. And don't forget to click the bell so that you're notified when there's new content. I hope to see you all again real soon. Be yourselves. Bye-bye.